Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE was established 14 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. The Bush and Obama administrations launched wars in the Mideast and killed well over a million people on the excuse of 9/11. But the U.S. hasn't achieved that control. But the Obama administration hasn't stopped trying for it or stopped killing people, although they've managed to hide much of it from the American people, if not from the rest of the world. There was a Democratic candidate's presidential debate last Saturday, but much of the media attention is directed to Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't vote to kill 1 million Muslims in Iraq, but Hillary Clinton did. The excellent reporter Glenn Greenwald observes that the U.S. media is acting as though Donald Trump just invented racism towards Muslims. But not only is anti-Muslim racism not new, implicit racism toward Muslims has been the foundation of the largest public project in the United States for the last quarter century, the war in the Mideast. The driving forces behind war planning in Washington are power, domination, profit, politics, and the acquiescence in war planning as a path towards career success, as Barack Obama illustrates. Elected because the American people thought he opposed the war in the Mideast, he's in fact conducted it even more viciously than George Bush did. In our lifetimes, U.S. government leaders have overthrown a democracy in Iran and armed Muslim fundamentalists in Afghanistan and Iraq. They have no qualms about toppling secular governments in Iraq or Libya or Syria. The most ISIS weaponry is U.S. weaponry seized from that most of the weapons that ISIS has are weapons from the U.S. seized from Iraq, that can only please the profiteers who will sell the weapons to combat ISIS. The Obama administration's best friends are the killer Muslims running Saudi Arabia and nearby kingdoms. Many people in the United States, when they stop to think about it, recognize that the wars of recent decades have been counterproductive, creating enemies rather than eliminating them, endangering rather than protecting, costing a mountain of lives and of dollars, savagely destroying the natural environment, eroding civil liberties in the name of wars for so-called freedom, and brutalizing morality, justifying murder, torture, kidnapping, etc. by American forces. But with fear and hatred of Muslims thrown into the mix, all of that clear understanding is erased by the need to kill Muslims. Suddenly, a rich stew of World War II myths and Hollywood entertainment reminds everyone that only war works and nothing else is acceptable. Donald Trump didn't vote for the war in Iraq that killed 1 million Muslims. He didn't vote to fund it and escalate it over and over again. Hillary Clinton did that, which is not to say that Trump wouldn't have done so too, or worse, if he thought it would get him on TV more. The point is that the hatred is not new. Without it, basic U.S. policy would be understood as irrational. As Noam Chomsky points out, the U.S. is increasing the possibility of large-scale terrorist attacks, similar to November 13th in Paris, by intensifying their airstrikes against the Islamic State group in Iraq and Syria. ISIS have themselves said that if you bomb us, we will attack you, and this is probably the short-term cause of the terrorist attacks carried out in Paris. If the West wants to reduce the possibility of further terrorist attacks, it needs to address the root causes of the terrorist attacks in Paris. These root causes are the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the Wahhabization of Sunni Islam, which in turn resulted in the rise of global radical Islamism. As the leading English language reporter on the Mideast, Patrick Coburn, points out, Donald Trump is mostly right about the Middle East when he's being repeatedly interviewed as presidential candidate. The interviewers for television and newspapers are generally hostile, or at least patronizing and incredulous, when Trump speaks positively about Russian intervention in Syria, the need to combat ISIS, and the disastrous state of Iraq and Libya. Most of what he is saying is common sense, but it's a measure of the degree to which propaganda slogans have replaced realistic discussion of these problems that his remarks are immediately dismissed or derided by politicians and the media. Asked by an NBC News presenter if Iraq and Libya had been better off when Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi were in power, a question most politicians would have dodged, Trump said, "Iraq is a disaster. Libya is not even a country. You can make the case if you look at Libya, look at what we did there, it's a mess. If you look at Saddam Hussein with Iraq, look what we did there, it's a mess." Trump said in another interview that it's wrong to tell people who have had dictatorships or worse for centuries how to run their own countries. After Saturday's debate, Trump offered an accurate assessment of Clinton as Secretary of State. She may have traveled a lot, but she didn't do the job because the entire world blew up around her. So she wasted a lot of time and energy and money, and frankly, she wasted a lot of lives because her policies were a disaster for the world. The Middle East has blown up around her. Her decisions were horrible, and hundreds and thousands of people have been killed because of her faulty decisions. It should by now be clear that defeating ISIS and bringing an end to the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars can only be brought about by agreement between the 5 main outside powers involved in the war: the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey. They alone have influence over allies and proxies inside Syria and Iraq to force them to negotiate seriously. We must demand of Obama and his successor, probably Clinton, that he, 1, end his continuing drone killings. He's killed more than 6,000 people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. The New York Times says Obama chooses the targets himself. 2, he must bring all U.S. troops and mercenaries home. Obama is today making war in 8 countries, 2 more than George Bush ever did. 3, he must close the 1,000 foreign U.S. bases. No other country in the world has more than 12. 4, he must end the provocations of Russia and Ukraine and China and the South China Sea. And 5, he must withdraw support, economic, military, political, and diplomatic, for Israel's apartheid policy. In a book on the last presidential campaign, President Obama is quoted as follows: "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine," close quote. However ironically he meant it, the quote has not been denied by the White House, and it turns out to be true. Today, the Obama administration is conducting wars throughout the Mideast, acting with belligerence towards China, and promoting an ongoing proxy war against Russia and Ukraine that has already killed more people than America's client Israel killed in Gaza in 2014. The U.S. supports Israel's attacks on its neighbors and its illegal occupation of Palestinian territories, not just because of the influence of an Israel lobby in the U.S. There are, in fact, lobbies with even more influence on the U.S. government, notably the defense lobby, weapons makers. Israel, in fact, is the U.S. government's stationary aircraft carrier in the Mideast for a domination of the region. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't hear much of it in the American media. We'll mention some of it tonight, beginning with Santa's little helper here on my right, Ron Zook.
Yes, well, the Death's Head here is a reminder that during the season, when we celebrate the birth of the Prince of Peace, that the killing still goes on every day, and occasionally you'll find a body count in the media, the number of people killed today by one side or the other. But here's a reference. Reuters, at the end of November, the Israeli police shot dead a Palestinian who stabbed an officer. The incident is the latest attack in a 2-month wave of violence. what we hear about are the frequent stabbings of Israeli soldiers by Palestinians, particularly women and children. Israeli forces at the end of November have killed 94 Palestinians, many of whom were carrying out assaults, and others who were in clashes with police and troops. Many of those killed have been teenagers. So a little arithmetic shows that the Israeli kill ratio was about 4.7 to 1. The later figures in the last 3 weeks show that the ratio of Palestinians to Israelis killed is up to about 5.1 now. So, so much for the Palestinian terrorists who apparently should submit quietly and meekly to having their land taken, their houses destroyed, and their children killed. So here's a representation of what's going on from the Foreign Affairs Magazine, Foreign Policy, I'm sorry. The tragedy of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So the green area here is that occupied by the Palestinians in 1947. The United Nations plan gave all of the white area to Israel. By 1967, especially during the 67 war, this is the area still occupied by the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And here's what it's become today from 2005 to 2015. A little scattering of Palestinian settlements that are left there. Ban Ki-moon, headline, the United Nations Secretary General, says the wave of violence in Israel and the West Bank is bred from decades of Israeli occupation. Israel's ambassador to the UN responded by saying that there was no justification for terrorism. Ban Ki-moon has described the continuing bloodshed in Israel and the West Bank as the result of, quote, nearly 5 decades of Israeli occupation. In a message delivered to a United Nations conference on Palestinian issues and Jerusalem, the Secretary General urged all sides to stop the violence that has left more than 130 people dead in less than 3 months. Palestinians have launched almost daily stabbings that have killed 20 Israelis, while Israeli security forces have retaliated by killing 116 Palestinians, including 79 said to be carrying out attempting attacks. Others died in clashes and protests. Next headline from Reuters, again at the end of November. Israel said Sunday that it was suspending contacts with European Union bodies involved in peace efforts with the Palestinians after the bloc started requiring the labeling of exports from Israeli settlements on the West Bank. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is also the foreign minister, ordered the ministry to carry out a, quote, reassessment of the involvement of EU bodies, European Union bodies, in everything that is connected with the diplomatic process with the Palestinians, a ministry statement said. Until completion of the reassessment, the Prime Minister has ordered a suspension of diplomatic contacts with the EU and its representatives in this matter. So there's the standoff and how it continues. So the land claimed by Israel, or dominated, controlled by Israel, continues to expand. And the justifications that are giving for this are, well, first of all, God gave it to us. This is part of greater Israel, Judea and Samaria. Second, anyone who opposes this is a terrorist and, of course, an anti-Semite. And And there is a narrative, of course, used by Israel to justify this in the more secular realm of we need it for our defense. So we need Lebensraum, and we need to defend ourselves, and so that's why we can keep expanding, and anyone who criticizes this is an anti-Semite, apparently. So we can keep leapfrogging, occupying more and more land, and then claiming that we need the land around that, bordering it, to defend that newly acquired land, and so it goes, with no apparent limit. So that's what's happening in Israel and occupied Palestine. Another aspect of the Middle Eastern quagmire, 6 American soldiers were killed in Afghanistan. Today we were told that we were disengaging there, and the combat troops would be removed, and of course that was a trick. There's still plenty of American soldiers, military people in there, but they're supposedly doing other things like training and support and so on. So I don't have today's body count, but if you look at the media, you can find it. Oh, here it is. From Washington Post yesterday, 6 U.S. troops dead, others wounded in an apparent suicide attack in Afghanistan. The U.S.-led military in Afghanistan suffered one of its worst days in 2015 on Monday, as 6 U.S. service members were killed and 3 others were wounded in a motorcycle laden with explosives detonated near them in Parwan province in an apparent suicide attack, which is very near, next to the enormous Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan. This says that while the U.S. military no longer carries out offensive operations in Afghanistan following the end of its formal combat mission, it patrols around the base daily to protect it against the Taliban and other enemy groups. So if there's time, I'll come back to the South Pacific, which I've talked about several times before, but there I'll stop with with this note on the Middle East.
You got to get back to the toy workshop, right?
Yeah, right.
A lot of work to do before. Yeah. You're watching Aware on the Air. We are in the midst of our last program for the year 2015, and I must say that there have been a number of interesting and important developments in American war policy and our understanding of it this last week that I think maybe obscured a bit, not just by the quadrille, the presidential election nonsense that we have been treated to, but also by the holiday and whatnot, so that we're really not talking about what the American government is actually doing in its process of killing people around the world. And that's obviously something we should be paying attention to. I'd like to come back to the issue of just how anti-war the American public is. I think it's much more anti-war than our leaders tell us it is, and that presidential candidates tell us it is. But there were 2 important articles this week in the press about the American war policy and American politics in regard to the Middle East. They remind us that jihadism, militant Muslim fundamentalism, was invented by the United States 40 years ago to use against the Soviet Union. And they also tell us that perhaps even more shockingly, the Obama administration is using jihadism again today. That's the source for the sort of conspiracy theories we get sometimes that ISIS is really a put-up job by the U.S. and Israel. There's just a germ of truth in that, although the full-blown conspiracy notion is pretty clearly false. And for that reason, it's worthwhile to rehearse the history of U.S. involvement with jihadism, the U.S. invention of jihadism by finding the most fanatical Muslim fighters in the 1970s and sending them into Afghanistan before the Russian invasion in order to provoke the Russians. That the policy then, and even in many ways the policy now, is directed towards Russia. What the U.S. is doing in its sponsorship of jihadism is worthwhile to bear in mind. And we can find an account of that, an account of the origins of this policy 40 years ago, from the man who was largely responsible for constructing it. Zbigniew Brzezinski, still a foreign policy expert for the Obama administration and the Democratic Party particularly, was national security advisor to President Jimmy Carter in the 1970s. 20 years later, he gave an interview to a French magazine before 9/11 that described some of the ways in which jihadism, the mujahideen, that is the Islamic fighters, were a product of American policy. Brzezinski was asked, the former director of the CIA, Robert Gates, stated in his memoirs that the American intelligence services began to aid the mujahideen in Afghanistan 6 months before the Soviet intervention. In this period, you were the national security advisor to President Carter. You therefore played a key role in this affair. Is that correct? Brzezinski answered, yes. According to the official version of history, CIA aid to the Mujahideen, the jihadist fighters, began during 1980, that is to say after the Soviet Army invaded Afghanistan on December 24th, 1979. But the reality, closely guarded until now, is completely otherwise. Indeed, it was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. The opponents were these fanatical Muslim fighters. And that very day, said Brzezinski, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that in my opinion this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention into Afghanistan. Question. Despite this risk, you were an advocate of this covert action. Perhaps you yourself desired the Soviet entry into the war and looked for a way to provoke it? Brzezinski, it wasn't quite like that. We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. Question. When the Soviets justified their intervention by asserting that they intended to fight against secret U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, nobody believed them. However, there was an element of truth in this. You don't regret any of this today? Brzezinski, regret what? That secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap. And you want me to regret it? The day that the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter, essentially, we now have the opportunity of giving to the USSR its Vietnam War. Indeed, for almost 10 years, Moscow had to carry on a war that was unsustainable for the regime, a conflict that brought about the demoralization and finally the breakup of the Soviet Empire. Question. And neither do you regret having supported Islamic fundamentalism, which has given arms and advice to future terrorists? Brzezinski, what is more important in world history, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some agitated Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? Question, some agitated Muslims? But it's been said and repeated, Islamic fundamentalism represents a world menace today. Brzezinski, nonsense. It's said that the West has a global policy in regard to Islam. That is stupid. There isn't a global Islam. Look at Islam in a rational manner, without demagoguery or emotionalism. It's the leading religion of the world with 1.5 billion followers. But what is there in common amongst fundamentalist Saudi Arabia, moderate Morocco, militarist Pakistan, pro-Western Egypt, or secularist Central Asia? Nothing more than what unites the Christian countries. Now, It's the end of the interview with Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Carter National Security Advisor in 1998, about how modern jihadism was a product essentially of the policy of the Carter administration, the product of Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, if we look at the situation today, we find that the Obama administration's war in the Mideast, which is perfectly consistent with American actions back to the Second World War of trying to control the energy resources of the Middle East, includes, as it has all along, support for the states that are supporting jihadism, notably Saudi Arabia, the most fundamentalist Muslim state in the world, and the Gulf Cooperation Council, the sheikdoms along the Gulf. The current Harpers Magazine has an article by Andrew Coburn, author of an extremely important book called Kill Chain, about how the Obama administration really is fighting its wars around the world and where the technology that they're using comes from. But Harper's publishes Coburn's new article entitled A Special Relationship, The United States is Teaming Up with Al-Qaeda Again. Close quote. In spite of the monstrous blowback of 9/11 from Brzezinski's policy, which occurred after the interview that I was reading, of course, over the past year, distinguished figures in the U.S. government, I'm quoting Coburn now, have voiced support for a closer relationship with Al-Qaeda's rebranded extensions. Al-Qaeda, the group that was responsible, by all accounts, for the 9/11 atrocities, has metastasized into various and sundry other groups, although the group itself still exists. Coburn continues, David Petraeus, former head of the CIA, has argued for arming at least the more moderate parts of Al-Qaeda in Syria. Robert Ford, a former ambassador to Syria and a vociferous supporter of the rebel cause, that is the opposition to the Syrian government, called on America to open channels for dialogue with Ahrar al-Sham, another alias of al-Qaeda, even if its members had on occasion slaughtered some Alawites and desecrated Christian sites. These are the non-Muslim groups that back the Syrian government. Even Foreign Affairs, an establishment sounding board, the Journal, has echoed these notions, suggesting that it was time for the United States to rethink its policy towards al-Qaeda, particularly its targeting of Zawahiri, the current leader of al-Qaeda, successor to Osama bin Laden. The second article that talks about this this Obama administration support for jihadism is in the current London Review of Books, an article entitled Military to Military by Seymour Hersh, perhaps the most distinguished author of articles about American military policy going back to the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. Hersh chronicles the resistance of the U.S. military to the Obama's administration's support of jihadists and their support of the Sunni alliance, as we might call it, that is Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the Gulf Cooperation Council. Hersh writes, quote, Obama now has a more compliant Pentagon. There will be no more indirect challenges from the military leadership to his policy of disdain for Assad and support for Erdogan, the president of Turkey, who has Islamicized the secular Turkish constitution. The recently retired chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, and his associates remain mystified by Obama's continued public defense of Erdogan, given the American intelligence community's strong case against him, and the evidence that Obama in private accepts that case. Quote, we know what you're doing with the radicals in Syria, the president told Erdogan's intelligence chief at a tense meeting in the White House. The Joint Chiefs and the Defense Intelligence Agency were constantly telling Washington's leadership of the jihadist threat in Syria and of Turkey's support for it. The message was never listened to. Why not? Close quote. This is Seymour Hersh in this important article about the U.S. government's policy in regard to jihadism? The answer is the CIA today, like the Carter administration 40 years ago, thinks it can use Muslim fanatics for its own purposes. And part of those purposes is annoying Russia. The Pentagon doesn't think so. This is what Hirsch reveals in his article. But Obama has sided with the CIA, and the U.S. continues its covert support for jihadism through its support of the faction in the Middle East that includes Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, the GCC, and Turkey. So what the U.S. is doing, in that sense, is a continuation of the pro-jihadist policy that goes back 40 years, and the result is the murderous situation throughout the Middle East that the U.S. is at some pains to misrepresent, particularly to the American people. So we had the remarkable spectacle this last week of Secretary of State Kerry in the Soviet Union, in Moscow, no longer the Soviet Union, in Moscow, saying that the U.S. is not insisting upon regime change in Syria. We're not insisting that Assad must go. And 3 days later, President Obama in Washington says, oh, yes, we are. The matter is, the policy remains what I've said it is. That is, we're demanding that the secular government of Syria go. Now, in this mess, it's very difficult to see what is going on simply because the U.S. government is at such pains to obscure what, in fact, it's doing. In fact, if there's anything that can be said about Obama's foreign policy, it's been primarily a matter of hiding from the American people the continuation of the war policy that Obama inherited and perfected, in part by putting it undercover, driving it underground. And we seem to be in the midst of that today, but plus ça change, the American support for jihadism turns out, shockingly enough, in spite of 9/11, to continue in the Obama administration. You're watching Aware on the Air, our attempt each week to try to say something that's not being said by the American media about what the American government is doing in conducting wars around the world.
Well, a number of these things are, in fact, mentioned in the media, even in the local daily, but you have to look at them, look for them, and look at them very carefully to figure out what's actually being said and what significance it might have. Let me add, as a pendant to what I said earlier about the Middle Eastern quagmire and the killing going on daily in Israel, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and so on. Headline from Baghdad, December 19th, Washington Post, an airstrike by U.S.-led coalition this week killed 10 Iraqi soldiers, the Iraqi government said Saturday, in an apparent friendly fire incident in which the U.S. Defense Secretary says both sides shared responsibility. So, hey, it wasn't entirely our fault. Mistakes were made. Iraqi defense minister at a news conference in Baghdad said 1 Iraqi officers and 9 soldiers were killed in the strike on Friday, which took place south of the city of Fallujah, about 40 miles west of Baghdad. Obadeh, the Iraqi defense minister, said the death toll was a correction to earlier statements that said just 1 Iraqi soldier had died, a fact that was disputed by soldiers who witnessed the strike. So they supplied the corrective, and if they hadn't spoken up, the official story would have been that the body count was only 1, but actually it seems that it was 10. And so it goes. No official statement can be believed at its face value. And as we were reminded by, what's his name? The governments always lie.
I.F. Stone.
Yeah, I.F. Stone, Izzy Stone. nothing they say can be taken at face value. So,
And Evie Stone's contemporary, Claude Coburn, the father of the man whose article I was quoting a moment ago, is responsible for the article from the remark from about the same period. Believe nothing until it's officially denied.
yeah, right.
And that seems to me to be about right. And Stone, if Stone didn't quote that, he should have. He would have agreed.
Okay, as we're ramping up to the next war, then Japan, apparently under American pressure, is becoming more and more aggressive toward China. And the USA is continuing to carry out provocations against China and the South China Sea, because they are building up these tiny islands there, atolls, coral reefs they are actually in some cases. This is from the USA Today, December 19th. China urges U.S. to stop provocative actions after B-52 flights. China called the United States to end provocative military action Saturday after two B-52 bombers flew near islands in the South China Sea that Beijing claims it owns. The Pentagon said Friday it is investigating the December 10th incident, which it characterized as a routine training mission. China's military went on high alert during the incident and ordered the American bombers to leave the area. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said, according to the official Chinese Xinhua news agency. China takes the incident seriously, he said. Once again, we urge the United States to seriously reflect upon and correct its mistakes, take effective measures to prevent similar dangerous and provocative actions, and to stop any move that might undermine Chinese sovereignty. China claims territorial sovereignty in virtually all of the South China Sea, which includes some of the world's busiest trade routes. 5 other countries have competing claims in the same region. Washington has said that international law does not give China any territorial rights around the new artificially built islands. The disputed area is a collection of reefs and islets known as the Spratly Islands, but which China calls something else. China has increased its presence in the region over the last decade and is dredging sand and building major land-based facilities, including long runways and deep water ports on the islands. Neighboring nations such as Vietnam and the Philippines have protested the moves. Next provocation, U.S. $1.83 billion arms sale to Taiwan, which the headline says draws China's ire. Washington, AP, Associated Press, December 16th. The Obama administration announced a $1.83 billion arms sale to Taiwan on Wednesday, drawing an immediate rebuke and threats of retaliation from Taipei's rival Beijing. The arms package is the first offered by the U.S. to the self-governing island in 4 years. Even before its announcement, Beijing, which regards Taiwan as a part of its territory, demanded that it be scrapped to avoid harming relations across the Taiwan Strait and between China and the U.S. This was followed by a formal diplomatic protest late Wednesday, although at a lower level than in previous instances. Quote, China resolutely opposes the sale of weapons to Taiwan by the U.S., the vice foreign minister said in a meeting in Washington with Washington's second highest ranking diplomat in Beijing. So the other points here, I think, are things that I've mentioned. So we'll go back to Carl.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching We're on the Air. We are talking about the news that is not being considered very much in this slow news week for the American media, but very important news indeed regarding the U.S. activities, U.S. government activities and war around the world, and the continuation of war by other means, the economic contest that the U.S. has been fighting with the rest of the world since its domination was established by World War II. We have recommended a couple of important discussions of U.S. politics, and I have a third. Well, I mentioned the two articles by Andrew Coburn and Seymour Hersh. I have a third one that connects to what Ron was just talking about. Michael Hudson has a piece at the Counterpunch website this week entitled "The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, Changes Its Rules to Isolate China and Russia." This connects the various elements we've been discussing already this evening. Hudson writes, "The nightmare scenario of U.S. geopolitical strategists seems to be coming true. Foreign economic independence from U.S. control. Instead of privatizing and neoliberalizing the world under U.S.-centered financial planning and ownership, the Russian and Chinese governments are investing in neighboring economies on terms that cement Eurasian economic integration on the basis of Russian oil and tax exports and Chinese financing. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank threatens to replace the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank programs that favor U.S. suppliers, banks, and bondholders, with the United States holding unique veto power." Now, what's at stake here is the world economic order that was established by the U.S. in the wake of World War II, and that sees as the primary challenge an integrated Eurasia, basically a conjunction between China and Russia, that would remove control of the world economy from the hands of the American 1% and invest some of that control into these foreign states, these lesser breeds without the law. The law is the economic laws that the U.S. has been operating under literally for generations, and the attempt to maintain the control of those rules is a fundamental motivator of American politics and a fundamental motivator of American killing around the world. And to ignore that is to miss really what's going on. I recommend Michael Hudson's article. I will put links to all three articles that I've mentioned here and one or two others on the AWARE Facebook page, and you can see the full text there.
To change focus now to the domestic scene and say something more about racism and its setting in the USA. Here's a report, Reuters, yesterday from Chicago. Police in the United States killed at least 1,152 people in the United States this year through December 15th, with the 60 largest police departments disproportionately killing black people, according to data compiled by activists who run the Mapping Police Violence Project. The group said that most police departments did not provide numbers on officer-involved fatalities, so its data comes from three crowdsourced databases. The references are given here that you can click on if you look this up. 40% of the people killed by police in the country's 60 biggest police departments were black, while the African American population of those jurisdictions was 20%, the report said. So how do you interpret the disparity that we've been hearing so much about recently? Well, that is a continuing problem, but anyway, this group, formed by data scientist Samuel Singawe and some activists, said the 2015 figure compares with 1,172 last year and 1,140 in 2013. The group says it believes its database reflects 90 to 98% of the police killings since 2013. The project compiles data on all fatal uses of force by the police, including gunshot, asphyxiation, vehicles, and tasers. It includes unintentional killings such as people who died of a medical emergency while being arrested or detained, and off-duty incidents. So the killings go on while we're celebrating the season of peace and joy. Mayor Emanuel of Chicago has taken, quote, full responsibility for the degenerate state of the Chicago police, apparently. But this, as usual, turns out to mean nothing. It's, I would say, just more grandstanding. We're not hearing very much about the blue code that exists in a number of places, in most big city police departments, apparently, where policemen are apparently committed to covering up for each other. And it doesn't matter what they do, there will be the, you will encounter the wall of silence if anyone tries to investigate that or find out what actually went on. This is a reminder of the police scandal in New York City in the late 60s, early 70s, associated with the name of Serpico, the policeman who began to talk about what was going on in the New York City Police Department and came very close to being killed by his colleagues there in New York City for spilling the beans, letting the cat out of the bag, and letting it be known what was actually going on in the department. What can we do to overcome this code of silence in the police departments? Well, that's a difficult thing to deal with, and I'd be glad to hear any suggestions that anyone might have. In part, it's, I think, a result of occupational circling the wagons against every outside influence and criticism and so on. There's a certain amount, I think, of occupational and ethnic solidarity going on in these big city police departments, especially in the eastern half of the country. They tend to be, these police departments tend to be dominated by Italian and Irish policemen, and that ethnic identification is very important to them in many cases, it seems. Policemen constantly face what's sometimes called role strain by the sociologists. They're expected to do something that they claim that in order to actually do that, they have to do things that are extremely unsavory and that people don't want to see them do. So they're caught in this kind of dilemma. They are what some sociologists have called the dirty workers, doing the things that we want done, keeping down the criminal element and the blacks and so on. But we don't want to know the techniques that they think they have to use in order to accomplish that task, because it's a dirty, ugly, and sometimes murderous business. And so what is the real function of the police? Well, their role has degenerated from serving and protecting to the public needing some kind of protection from them. And how do we do that? I don't know. It's a continuing unsolved problem. And meanwhile, the killing goes on. Sure.
Someone sent me the following quotation from the American author Kurt Vonnegut this week that may have some bearing on the problems that Ron's discussing. Vonnegut, the late Kurt Vonnegut, wrote, "America is the wealthiest nation on earth, but its people are mainly poor, and poor Americans are urged to hate themselves. Every other nation has folk traditions of men who were poor but extremely wise and virtuous, and therefore more estimable than anyone with power and gold. No such tales are told by American poor. They mock themselves and glorify their betters." Close quote. Rather what the psychologist Anna Freud called identification with the aggressor. And I think some of our discussion of police in this country is bound up with these particular psychological phenomena that are finally based in the severe class divisions within American society. You're watching We're on the Air. We have covered a number of things this evening. I would like to go back to one point that both Ron and I both raised, and that is the question of Israel and American policy and the situation of Israel and the Palestinians as it continues to descend today. Two important points seem to me that need to be made about what Israel is doing in its apartheid policy against the Palestinians. The situation described by Ron with the map behind me that has developed over the last 50 years. Two important points. First of all, the U.S., the Israeli suppression of the Palestinians, the suppression of the Palestinian state and the occupation of the Palestinian territories would not be possible. It would not be possible for it to continue in the face of world opposition. Similar things happen in South Africa, after all. It would not be possible for it to continue except for the fact that Israel has the support of the United States, economic, military, political, and diplomatic support, that in the absence of which the Israeli apartheid policy would fall apart. There are enough opponents to it around the world as there was to apartheid in South Africa. And Israel's apartheid in the occupied territories is certainly worse than what was going on in South Africa, the oppression of the blacks by the majority whites. The second point that needs to be remembered in connection with the conclusion for the first point is that BDS and other groups, the boycott, divestment, and sanction groups and others that target Israel should perhaps be directing their protests to Washington rather than Tel Aviv. It's Washington that makes the Israeli oppression possible. In the absence of Washington, of support from the U.S., that oppression would not be possible. So it's indeed our responsibility as Americans to bring that to an end. The second point, and the point necessary to realize, realize in order to attack the American policy, is that the U.S. supports Israel not for the purposes of the Israelis, or for the Israeli lobby in this country, which certainly exists, or for a presumed obligation to the victims of the Second World War. That's not why the U.S. supports Israeli oppression. The U.S. supports Israeli oppression because it's convenient for American policy in the Middle East. I began the show this evening by pointing out the long-term cornerstone, to mix the metaphor, of American policy, which is control of Middle East energy resources as a weapon against our American economic competitors around the world. That's been American policy since the Second World War. The support for the government of Israel grows out of that fundamental policy point. Israel is, as it were, a stationary aircraft carrier for the United States in its military control of the Middle East. If Israel were to stop playing that role, the U.S. would have no interest in supporting Israel's suppression of the Palestinians. We don't care about the Palestinians or even about the Israelis as far as that goes. What we care about, and when I say we, of course, I mean the American government, what we care about is control of these economic resources for the benefit of the American 1%. And until we understand that, American policy doesn't make much sense. Same is true of the American policy regarding jihadism that I was talking about earlier this evening. It doesn't make much sense unless we understand what the goals and nature of American long-term policy in the region is. That's essential when we come to talk about Israel. Otherwise, we do end up blaming the Israelis for crimes for which we, as Americans, are finally responsible. You've been watching Aware on the Air. Final comment, Ron?
Yeah, what do we make of Chicago Mayor Emanuel's statement that he's taken full responsibility for what the Chicago police have done? That is very funny to me, but there's a lot of posturing like that going on among highly placed people who will say, oh yeah, I take full responsibility for what my underlings did, and yeah, nothing happens.
Yeah.
They remain in office.
What he doesn't say is, I take full responsibility and therefore I'm resigning.
Yeah, right, right. Well,
no. I take full responsibility and therefore I'm not resigning.
Have the decency to do what dishonored Japanese officials do and disembowel.
Honorable harakiri in downtown Chicago?
Right. I mean, when they take responsibility, they mean it seriously, according to the conventional story. But I'm not sure how much of that is actually true when Japanese statesmen and generals are dishonored, and they do mean it seriously in some cases.
That's our Christmas elf's Christmas story for this week. You've been watching Aware on the Air. Presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the last week of 2015. Another week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has yet seen, is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Today is what White House aides call Terror Tuesday, the day each week when President Obama picks out some people to be murdered by drones or U.S. death squads, the Special Operations Command. The president's underlings, notably CIA Director John Brennan, compile a list of who should be executed, and the president then chooses from baseball cards presented to him by John Brennan who shall die. The assassinations are carried out in secrecy. The administration doesn't release accounts of the people they kill. But literally thousands of men, women, and children have been killed on Obama's order, and we hear about it only when there are reports from abroad, usually, about the drone strikes. Most Americans don't know that the U.S. is running this terrorist program. It's thoroughly unconstitutional. Obama should be impeached for it. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to by the panel and announcements of upcoming events in Champaign-Urbana. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't: Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck and Merry Christmas.